Today we hear a part of the Passion story in which Jesus is arrested and eventually crucified. And then the part we heard from the 15th chapter of Mark today, 3 times we are told that Jesus was led. He was led away to Pilate bound for trial. After Pilate questions him, he's led away by the soldiers to the courtyard where he is mocked and abused. And then he is led away to be crucified. So he's led away bound, he's led as a captive prisoner, and then he is led away to death. Now, in the story, we also hear these people taunting him and speaking about him, that if he really was the Messiah, he could use his power to get himself down off of that cross. Which implies, as we would say, that Jesus has divine power, that he actually could have chosen a different path, that he allowed himself to be led. But the story tells us he was led. Led bound, led as a prisoner, led down this path toward death. When my boys were little, we would on occasion find ourselves at a theme park or amusement park someplace with rides. Now, I will get sick if I just look at a ride. Getting on a ride is a sure trip to queasiness, and it doesn't matter if it's a big raging roller coaster or a little kid ride that is meant to be gentle, I will get queasy. Now, when we would go on these trips with our kids, I wanted to also participate with what our family was doing, so I would go on rides even though I knew I was probably going to get sick. We would stand in line and go through that whole path on a way to that ride that I didn't really want to ride. Now, at the same time, with kids and as a parent, you want to sometimes model for them that it's good to try new things, good to try things that you might be afraid of or uncomfortable with. And so as they got older and knew that I was not a big fan of these things, I still would go to try to encourage them to do new and different and maybe uncomfortable things as well. Both reasons often landed me in those meandering lines that are sometimes very long on my way to a ride that I did not want to ride. And the older they got, the harder those rides got, and the more I didn't look forward to the sickness that would come when I got to that ride that I did not want to ride. Now, it was my choice to enter into those lines, but sometimes as people, we find ourselves in circumstances that are not of our choosing, where we're being led down a path that is not a ride that we want to ultimately ride. The pandemic that we're in is a great example. None of us would have chosen this. We didn't go out and plan for this to happen, but we are stuck on this roller coaster with all of these ups and downs of testing and vaccines and closures and economic struggles and being shut in at home and all of it. It's a circumstance that happened to us. It just is. And it feels sometimes like we are bound on this path that we don't want to be on, that we are captive to this path that we are not wanting to choose, and for some it even leads to that place of death. Sometimes circumstances land us in a line for a ride that we don't want to ride. I'm mindful of my time at Children's Hospital when I was a chaplain during seminary, and the number of families that I encountered who were on a ride they did not want to be on. Sometimes it was a diagnosis of a lifelong illness for their child. Sometimes it was an accident. Sometimes the scariest ones seemed to be seizures in little babies, right? The parents were now signed up for a journey that they did not choose. I encountered quite a few families who had children that were born with profound disabilities that would leave them in the specialized wheelchairs for the rest of their lives. Most of them were nonverbal, and they had regular visits to the hospital due to scheduled visits, but also the health things that would come up along the way because their children had long-term health issues. All of these parents loved their children and found them to be blessings, but yet they were on this path that they hadn't chosen and that this ride they would not want to be on, and yet were there. Somewhere in your life, you probably have had those experiences where some circumstances put you in a place you did not want to be. And whether it's with work or relationships or finances or something out in the neighborhood, we land in those places. And it's often a place of pain. It's a place of struggle. It's a place that is hard to get to, and especially if it's an event or something that's coming and we see it coming, we can end up feeling like we're in that line and not able to get out of it, and knowing that this uncomfortable stuff is headed our way. That's one thing when there are circumstances that get us there. It's a whole other thing when we make choices that land us in places where we feel like we no longer have a choice, where we feel bound up and captive. Think of little kids and peer pressure. They may go along with something and choose to go along with something, but then all of a sudden there's consequences, and they are now stuck with those consequences, even though that's not what they thought they were choosing at the beginning. And as we get older, those consequences often just get more intense, right? Because there's peer pressure for adults too. The tricky part is when we make those choices that get us there, we can't really blame it on the circumstances. We can do that when the circumstances land us in that line. But when we make our own choices to get us there, whether we overreach financially and that puts us in a tough spot, whether we say things out of anger that we didn't mean to say, or whatever it is that we do that lands us on a ride we do not want to be on, the hard part is when it's our own choices that get us there, we then have to turn back and reflect on the choices that we made, reflect on how we got where we are. And that is not something that we like to do. It's much better when we can blame the circumstances or blame someone else. But when I have to sit back and say, gosh, I shouldn't have did that. Or when I look back and know that there was something where I knew what was right or I knew what was faithful, but I did the other thing because it was more comfortable and convenient. Having to live in that space of knowing that I made those choices that got me stuck in this place that I didn't want to be. This is why we so often start worship with confession and forgiveness, to invite us into that uncomfortable space of thinking about our actions and our choices, especially those that have impacts on other people and get us stuck in situations that we cannot get ourselves out of. Whether it's circumstances or our own choices that land us in that line that we can't get out of on the ride we don't want to ride, today we encounter Jesus, who probably did have a choice, right? He did not have to proclaim the gospel the way he did that would put him at odds with the emperor and the religious leaders, but he did. He didn't have to let himself get arrested and let himself be led to trial and led to the courtyard to be beaten and abused and mocked and led to his death. But I don't think Jesus was so much choosing between exercising his power and allowing this terrible experience to happen. I actually think what Jesus was doing was choosing that terrible experience to choose life for us. Jesus chose us, chose to join us in our pain and struggle. Jesus certainly knew that as people, we would end up in places where we could not get out of line for the ride we did not want to ride. And by going on that journey and being led, Jesus experiences what we experience all the time, of being stuck in pain and suffering and struggle that we cannot get ourselves out of. He chooses not to get himself out of it. In that way, he joins us in our struggle and chooses us. And in choosing us, he also chooses life for us. It took me a bunch of years to figure out when I was at the amusement park or the theme park with my kids and we were stuck in that long line, that when you get to the end, so often you can just step right through the ride and not ride it. Or take a right turn and go out the exit that takes you, and then my family could go ride the ride and I meet them at the end. So that I ultimately could spend time with them the whole way through, skip the part that makes me sick, and end up in this other place where we can get reconnected. That's not exactly how Jesus' journey works. He actually does have to ride the ride of death, but he steps right through it and comes out the other side with new life. And that new life is then the gift that we get. Jesus chose this journey, and in doing so chose us, and in doing that chose to give us this gift of life. The tricky part about the gift of life, though, is that it doesn't allow us to just skip the line and go right past the ride that we don't want to ride. The circumstances that land us in those places and the choices that we make that land us in those places are often still with us. We still live in those places of pain and suffering and struggle. What this gift of life does, though, is remind us that Jesus chose us, Jesus does not abandon us, and Jesus is with us through the entire journey, dragging us to places of new life out the other side. When I was at Children's Hospital, I met one of those families that had a child that would be permanently in that wheelchair, nonverbal, and they were in because of a health crisis. And as I had a conversation with them, they did not complain about her health crisis. They knew that the doctors in that place that they trusted deeply would take care of her. They did not lament that this was the place that their daughter was in just then. They were full of hope. But they did have one complaint. There was a big theme park near them, and one of their daughter's greatest joys in life was to ride the most wicked roller coasters that they had. They would take this girl and get her on those roller coasters and just let her adventurous side be able to explore all of that. The complaint that they had that day was that the theme park had decided that it was too risky to allow her to ride those rides, and they weren't going to let her do that anymore. So the very thing that I don't want to do, right, go ride that big roller coaster, was the very thing she did want to do in this particular theme park, put her in a different line. A line she didn't want to be in and a path she didn't want to be on. But I left that room knowing that they would be okay, because they carried with them that sense that something new could yet happen, that there would be other opportunities for her to be adventurous, and that they would continue to journey as a family together in grace and love. And I don't think it was because they had willed themselves to that, but perhaps because they knew that Jesus had chosen them. Jesus had chosen her, just as Jesus has chosen each and every one of us to receive this gift of life. Yes, we may find ourselves on rides we do not want to be on, but Jesus is right there with us and is never going to let us go. Amen.